Sarah clutched the crumpled will in her trembling hands, reading the words for the 100th time. "I leave everything to my eldest daughter, Jessica." The ink seemed to mock her as tears blurred her vision. Her father's law office felt suffocating, the mahogany walls closing in around her as Jessica sat smugly across the table, already planning how she'd spend their father's fortune. "I told you, Sarah," Jessica said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "Dad always loved me more. You were just the accident that came 10 years later." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wanting this family drama to end. Sarah had expected something, anything, after caring for their ailing father for the past 3 years, while Jessica lived her glamorous life in Manhattan, visiting maybe twice a year. "But I was the one who took care of him," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I gave up my job, my apartment, everything to move back home and nurse him through his illness." Jessica's laugh was sharp and cruel. "And what did that get you? A big fat nothing. Maybe next time you'll think twice before playing the martyr." Sarah stood slowly, her legs shaky. The modest inheritance she'd expected would have helped her restart her life, maybe go back to school, find a new career path. Now she had nothing but a few personal items and a crushing sense of betrayal. Outside the law office, Sarah sat in her 10-year-old Honda, sobbing until her chest ached. She'd moved back to their small hometown of Millbrook 3 years ago, putting her marketing career on hold to care for their father through his battle with Alzheimer's. She'd changed his diapers, fed him when he forgot how to eat, held his hand through countless doctor appointments, while Jessica sent flowers and made excuses about being too busy with work. The irony wasn't lost on her that Jessica worked as a real estate agent, selling other people's family homes while neglecting her own family. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord, reminding her that rent was due next week. With no job and no inheritance, Sarah faced the terrifying prospect of homelessness. She'd burned through her savings during Dad's illness, confident that the will would provide some security. Her father had always promised to take care of both his daughters, but apparently, those promises meant nothing when put to paper. That evening, Sarah packed her few belongings into garbage bags, the weight of her situation crushing her spirit. She'd have to move in with her friend Maya temporarily, sleeping on a couch and starting over at 32 with absolutely nothing. As she loaded her car, she found an old photo album of family memories. Page after page showed her and Dad together. Fishing trips, school plays he'd attended, graduations he'd celebrated with pride. Jessica appeared in maybe a dozen photos total, usually looking bored or checking her phone. 3 months passed in a blur of rejection letters and dead-end interviews. Sarah worked part-time at a local coffee shop, barely making enough to contribute to Maya's grocery bill. Her self-esteem had hit rock bottom, and she'd started having panic attacks whenever she thought about her future. The small town felt like a prison, and everyone seemed to know about her family's drama. Customers at the coffee shop would whisper behind her back, some offering pity while others seemed to enjoy her downfall. One particularly difficult morning, Sarah was working the early shift when a man in an expensive suit walked in. He was tall, dark-haired, and had kind eyes that seemed to see right through her fake smile. "Double espresso, please," he said, his voice gentle despite the obvious stress lines around his eyes. Something about him seemed familiar, but Sarah couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Rough morning?" she asked, noting how he kept checking his phone with a worried expression. He looked up, surprised by her genuine concern. "You could say that. I'm actually here for a funeral today. Robert Chen, did you know him?" Sarah's heart stopped. "He was my father." The man's face immediately softened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm Marcus Reed. Your father was my business mentor when I was just starting out 15 years ago." Sarah felt a strange connection to this stranger who seemed to understand her grief. "He never mentioned you," she said honestly. Marcus smiled sadly. "He wouldn't have. Your father was humble like that." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. If her father was so proud, why had he left everything to Jessica? Marcus seemed to read her thoughts. "Sometimes the people we love make decisions that don't make sense to us. But that doesn't diminish the love itself." As Marcus left, he turned back one more time. I know this sounds forward, but would you like to have dinner sometime? I'd love to hear more stories about your father, and honestly, I could use some kindness in my life right now. Sarah hesitated. She looked terrible, wore thrift store clothes, and felt like damaged goods. But something about Marcus made her want to say yes. I'd like that, she whispered. Their first date was at a small Italian restaurant where Marcus listened intently as Sarah shared memories of her father. He told her about his own struggles growing up poor, how her father's belief in him had given him the courage to keep pursuing his dreams, even when everyone else called him crazy. Marcus was easy to talk to, never making Sarah feel ashamed about her current circumstances. When he drove her home in his modest sedan, she noticed he didn't try to impress her with expensive gestures or flashy displays of wealth. Over the following weeks, Marcus became Sarah's anchor in the storm of her grief and financial stress. He helped her find a better job at a marketing firm in the next town over, using his business connections but letting her earn the position through her own qualifications. Sarah slowly began rebuilding her confidence, remembering who she used to be before life knocked her down so hard. Marcus was patient with her emotional healing, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. They took long walks through Millbrook's downtown area, Marcus listening as Sarah processed her complicated feelings about her father and sister. I keep wondering if I imagined how close Dad and I were, she confided one evening. Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe he did love her more. Marcus stopped walking and gently took her hands. Sarah, love isn't about money or wills. Your father's love for you was real. I could see it in how he lit up whenever he mentioned your name. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus Reed wasn't just any successful businessman. He was the founder and CEO of Reed Industries, a tech empire worth over $8 billion. He lived simply by choice, driving regular cars and wearing off-the-rack suits, because material possessions had never brought him happiness. His wealth was something he rarely discussed, preferring to be loved for who he was rather than what he owned. Marcus had actually been married before, to a woman who'd only wanted his money. The divorce had been brutal and public, teaching him to be extremely careful about revealing his financial status. With Sarah, he felt something he'd never experienced before: genuine love from someone who knew nothing about his wealth. She cared about his thoughts, his dreams, his character. For the first time in years, Marcus felt truly valued as a person. 6 months after they met, Marcus knew he wanted to spend his life with Sarah. He'd fallen deeply in love with her strength, her compassion, and her resilience in the face of devastating betrayal. One evening, as they watched the sunset from a hilltop overlooking Millbrook, Marcus got down on one knee with a simple but beautiful ring. Sarah Chin, you've shown me what real love looks like. Will you marry me? Sarah said yes through happy tears, feeling like her life was finally beginning again. They planned a small, intimate wedding at the local botanical garden, inviting only close friends and family. Sarah sent an invitation to Jessica out of obligation, though she doubted her sister would come. To her surprise, Jessica RSVP'd yes, probably curious about Sarah's mysterious new boyfriend who'd managed to sweep her off her feet so quickly. The wedding was perfect in its simplicity. Sarah wore a vintage dress she'd found at a consignment shop, looking radiant despite the modest budget. Marcus's best man was actually Sarah's father's former business partner, who'd stayed in touch with Marcus over the years. During the ceremony, Marcus spoke about how Sarah had taught him that true wealth came from love, family, and genuine human connection. After the wedding, Sarah moved into Marcus's modest 3-bedroom home on the outskirts of town. She had no idea that this house was just one of 7 properties he owned worldwide, or that he'd deliberately chosen the most humble one for their shared life. Marcus continued. She started volunteering at the local senior center, inspired by her experience caring for her father. Marcus watched with pride as Sarah found her purpose again, knowing that her compassionate heart was exactly what had drawn him to her in the first place. The only shadow in their happiness was Sarah's ongoing grief over her father's death and her complicated feelings about Jessica. Despite everything, Sarah still missed having a sister relationship, though Jessica had made no effort to reconcile after taking the entire inheritance. Marcus encouraged Sarah to focus on building the family they would create together, rather than dwelling on the family that had hurt her so deeply. 1 year into their marriage, Sarah's world was shattered again when she received a call that her father's will was being contested. Apparently, a second will had been discovered in his safe deposit box, dated just a month before his death. This will left everything equally between both daughters and included a heartfelt letter apologizing to Sarah for the confusion. The lawyer explained that somehow the newer will had been misfiled, and Jessica had unknowingly inherited based on an outdated document. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that her father hadn't intentionally betrayed her, and anger that she'd spent a year believing she'd been unloved and forgotten. The legal process would take months to sort out, but it appeared that Sarah was entitled to half of her father's estate after all. When she told Marcus the news, he held her while she cried, understanding how complicated this vindication felt after so much pain. Jessica, predictably, fought the new will with every legal tool available. She'd already spent a significant portion of the inheritance on a luxury condo and expensive car, living far beyond her means in anticipation of her father's money lasting forever. The legal battle became nasty quickly, with Jessica accusing Sarah of forging documents and manipulating their dying father. The stress took a toll on Sarah's health, but Marcus was her constant support through every court appearance and lawyer meeting. During one particularly brutal deposition, Jessica's lawyer suggested that Sarah had married Marcus purely for his money, implying that she was a gold digger who'd targeted a wealthy man after losing her inheritance. Sarah was confused by the suggestion, since Marcus lived so modestly, but she defended their relationship passionately. "I married Marcus because he's kind and loving, and he saw value in me when I had nothing," she stated firmly. His financial status had nothing to do with it. The legal proceedings dragged on for 8 months, during which Sarah learned things about her father that both comforted and surprised her. Apparently, he'd been quietly supporting several local charities and had established a scholarship fund for students who couldn't afford college. He'd also kept detailed journals about his pride in Sarah's sacrifices and his disappointment in Jessica's selfish behavior. These documents became crucial evidence in proving that the newer will reflected his true intentions. Finally, the court ruled in Sarah's favor. The newer will was deemed authentic and legally binding, meaning Sarah was entitled to half of the estate plus compensation for the delay in receiving her inheritance. Jessica was ordered to repay the money she'd already spent, effectively bankrupting her and forcing her to sell the luxury items she'd purchased. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Jessica's greed had ultimately destroyed her financially. The day after the court ruling, Sarah received a vicious voicemail from Jessica, blaming her for ruining the family and promising that their relationship was over forever. Sarah felt sad but not surprised. Jessica had chosen money over family repeatedly, and now she was facing the consequences of those choices. Marcus reminded Sarah that she'd tried to maintain a relationship despite Jessica's cruelty, and that some people simply couldn't be reached no matter how much love was offered. 2 years passed peacefully. Sarah used her inheritance to establish a foundation in her father's memory, providing support for families dealing with Alzheimer's disease. She and Marcus talked about starting a family of their own, excited about creating the loving home they'd both always dreamed of. Sarah had no contact with Jessica, who'd moved to another state after the legal humiliation and financial ruin. Then, Sarah spent the week before the memorial service feeling nervous and emotional. She hadn't been to her father's grave since the burial, unable to face the reminder of their complicated last chapter. Marcus took time off work to support her through what he knew would be a difficult day. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," he promised, holding her close the night before the service. The memorial service was beautiful in its simplicity. About 30 people gathered around Robert Chen's new granite headstone, sharing memories and celebrating a man who'd touched many lives through his quiet generosity. Sarah spoke about her father's love of fishing and his terrible jokes, bringing both laughter and tears to the small crowd. As the service concluded, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since her father's death. As people began to leave, Sarah noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the cemetery. Jessica had come after all, looking older and more worn than Sarah remembered. She approached hesitantly, her designer clothes now obviously cheaper imitations of her former style. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I wanted to pay my respects to Dad." Sarah nodded, unsure what to say to the sister who'd caused her so much pain. "I heard about the will," Jessica continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for fighting it, I was just so angry and scared about money." Sarah studied her sister's face, seeing genuine remorse for perhaps the first time in years. "Dad would have wanted us to be there for each other," Sarah said carefully. "But I can't pretend that what you didn't hurt me deeply." Jessica nodded, tears starting to fall. "I know I was awful to you. I was jealous of how close you and Dad were. And I handled it terribly. I kept telling myself that you chose to take care of him, so you didn't deserve anything extra for it. But that was just me trying to justify my own selfishness." The conversation was interrupted when Marcus appeared at Sarah's side, having finished talking with some of the other mourners. "Jessica, this is my husband Marcus," Sarah said, surprised by how natural the introduction felt despite years of estrangement. Jessica looked up at Marcus, and her face went completely white. She staggered backward, her mouth falling open in shock. "Marcus Reed?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "The Marcus Reed? From Reed Industries?" Marcus looked uncomfortable, but nodded politely. "Yes, though I prefer to just be Sarah's husband in settings like this." Jessica's legs seemed to give out, and she collapsed onto a nearby bench, hyperventilating. "Oh my God," she gasped. "You're married to one of the richest men in America. Do you have any idea who your husband is, Sarah?" Sarah looked between her husband and sister, confused by Jessica's extreme reaction. "Of course I know who my husband is," she said slowly. "He's Marcus, he's kind and loving, and he makes me laugh every day." Jessica stared at her in amazement. "Sarah, your husband is worth over $8 billion. He's been on the Forbes list for the past 5 years. I can't believe you don't know." The cemetery fell silent except for Jessica's labored breathing. Sarah turned to Marcus, seeing the truth in his eyes. "Is that true?" she asked quietly. Marcus took her hands gently. "Yes, but I didn't tell you because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have. I've been hurt by people who only wanted my money before." Sarah felt dizzy as the implications sank in. Her husband wasn't just successful, he was one of the wealthiest people in the country. Jessica was still staring in shock, her mind clearly racing through the irony of the situation. She'd fought tooth and nail for their father's relatively modest inheritance, destroying her relationship with Sarah in the process. Meanwhile, Sarah had unknowingly married into wealth beyond Jessica's wildest dreams, and she'd done it through love rather than greed. The cosmic justice of it all seemed to overwhelm Jessica completely. "I gave up everything," Jessica whispered, more to herself than to Sarah and Marcus. "I destroyed our relationship over Dad's money, and you ended up with more wealth than I could have ever imagined. And you didn't even know." She looked up at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and devastation. "You really didn't marry him for—" Jessica stood up slowly, her face a mask of complex emotions. "I need to go," she said quietly. "Sarah, I'm truly sorry for everything I put you through. You deserved so much better from me." She turned to Marcus. "Take care of her. She's the best person in our family, and I was too stupid and selfish to see it until now." As Jessica walked away, Sarah called after her. "Jessica, wait." Her sister turned back hopefully. "If you ever want to try to rebuild our relationship, really try this time. I'm willing to work on it. But it has to be real, not because of Marcus's money." Jessica nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. And Sarah? Dad would be so proud of the woman you've become." After Jessica left, Sarah and Marcus sat quietly by her father's grave, processing the dramatic turn of events. "Are you angry that I didn't tell you?" Marcus asked nervously. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I'm overwhelmed, but not angry. I understand why you kept it private. I just need some time to wrap my head around this." They talked for hours about Marcus's wealth, his business empire, and how dramatically Sarah's life had just changed. Marcus explained his philosophy of living simply despite his fortune, his commitment to philanthropy, and his desire to use his resources to make a positive impact on the world. "Nothing has to change about how we live," he assured her, "unless you want it to." Sarah realized that while the revelation was shocking, it didn't fundamentally alter her feelings about her husband. She'd fallen in love with his character, his values, and his heart. The money was just a detail, albeit an enormous one. "I love you for exactly the same reasons I did an hour ago," she told him. "Though I might need some time to get used to the idea that I accidentally became a billionaire's wife." As they drove home from the cemetery, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd lost her father, been betrayed by her sister, struggled through poverty and grief, and somehow found love and happiness with a man who turned out to be one of the most powerful people in the world. The irony that Jessica had collapsed upon learning this truth wasn't lost on her. Sometimes the universe had a sense of humor about justice. That evening, Sarah called Maya to share the incredible news. Her best friend was shocked, but not entirely surprised. "I always thought there was something different about Marcus," Maya admitted. "He carried himself like someone used to being in charge, and he was way too calm about expensive restaurant bills. But honestly, Sarah, you two were so obviously in love that his bank account was the last thing on anyone's mind." Over the following weeks, Sarah gradually adjusted to her new reality. Marcus introduced her to his business associates and philanthropic partners, always presenting her as his equal partner rather than just his wife. Sarah discovered that she had strong opinions about how to use wealth responsibly, and Marcus valued her input on everything from corporate decisions to charitable giving. The foundation Sarah had started in her father's memory suddenly had access to unlimited resources. She expanded its mission to include support for caregivers, job training for people starting over after family crises, and scholarships for students from low-income families. Working alongside Marcus to make a positive impact gave their relationship an even deeper sense of purpose. Jessica reached out a few months later asking if they could meet for coffee. She'd gotten a job as a social worker, having realized that her real estate career had been driven by all the wrong motivations. "I want to help people instead of just making money off them," she explained. "Dad always said that success should be measured by how much you give back, not how much you accumulate." The sisters began slowly rebuilding their relationship, with Marcus's patient support. He understood that family healing took time and couldn't be rushed, even with unlimited resources. Jessica proved her sincerity by declining Sarah's offers of financial help, insisting that she needed to rebuild her life through her own efforts. "I don't want your money," she said firmly. "I want my sister back." A year later, Sarah and Marcus welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Grace. Jessica was present for the birth, having earned her way back into Sarah's life through consistent. At Grace's christening, Sarah stood surrounded by the people who mattered most. Marcus, who'd loved her when she had nothing. Maya, who'd supported her through the darkest times. Jessica, who'd found her way back to being a real sister. And dozens of friends whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. As she looked at her father's photo on the memory table, Sarah whispered a quiet thank you for the lessons that had prepared her for this extraordinary life. Jessica approached during the reception, holding her niece with tears in her eyes. "I almost missed all of this because I was so focused on money," she said softly. "Thank you for giving me a second chance to be part of this family." Sarah squeezed her sister's hand. "Dad always said that family was about forgiveness and second chances. I think he'd be happy to see us here together." As the celebration continued around them, Sarah reflected on the strange twists of fate that had shaped her story. She'd lost an inheritance, found true love, discovered unimaginable wealth, and rebuilt her family. Most importantly, she'd learned that the greatest treasures in life couldn't be written into wills or fought over in courtrooms. They lived in moments like these, surrounded by love and looking forward to whatever adventures lay ahead. 5 years passed in a blur of happiness and purpose. Grace grew into a bright, curious child who seemed to inherit both her mother's compassion and her father's strategic mind. Sarah had become deeply involved in Marcus's business operations, particularly the philanthropic arm of Reed Industries. Her background in marketing, combined with her genuine understanding of struggle and hardship, made her invaluable in identifying worthy causes and developing effective outreach programs. The foundation in her father's memory had grown into a major force for good, with offices in 12 cities and programs that had helped thousands of families navigate medical crises and financial hardship. Sarah often worked 18-hour days, driven by the knowledge that every dollar spent wisely could change someone's life. Marcus watched with pride as his wife transformed from a broken woman grieving her father into a powerful advocate for those who needed help most. Jessica had completed her social work degree and was now managing a program for elderly care in the next state over. She visited regularly, having developed a close relationship with Grace and a genuinely sisterly bond with Sarah. The transformation in Jessica was remarkable. She'd gone from a selfish, materialistic woman to someone who found deep satisfaction in helping vulnerable populations navigate complex social services. "I finally understand what Dad meant about real success," Jessica told Sarah during one of their monthly sister dinners. "I spent so many years chasing money and status, but this work gives me something I never had before. A sense of purpose that goes beyond myself." Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey from despair to fulfillment. Marcus had been equally transformed by his marriage to Sarah. Where he'd once been focused primarily on building his business empire, he now devoted equal energy to giving that wealth away responsibly. Sarah's influence had helped him see that true legacy wasn't measured in dollars accumulated, but in lives improved. Together, they'd pledged to give away 90% of their wealth during their lifetimes, following the example of other billionaire philanthropists. Their marriage faced its first real test when Grace was 3 years old and Sarah suffered a miscarriage during her second pregnancy. The loss devastated both of them, but particularly Sarah, who blamed herself despite doctors' assurances that these things sometimes happened without explanation. For several months, Sarah withdrew from her foundation work and struggled with depression, feeling like she was failing at the one thing that mattered most to her. Marcus proved his devotion during this dark period, taking a leave of absence from his company to focus entirely on supporting his wife. He held her through countless nights of tears, accompanied her to therapy sessions, and gently encouraged her to reconnect with the work that gave her life meaning. "Grace needs to see her mother fighting for what she believes in," he said during one particularly difficult conversation, "and the world needs what you have to offer." Jessica also stepped up during Sarah's crisis, flying in weekly to help with Grace and household responsibilities. The sister who'd once been too selfish to visit their dying father now dropped everything to support Sarah through her grief. "You were there for Dad when he needed you most," Jessica said simply. "Now it's my turn to be there for you." Slowly, with the support of her family and professional help, Sarah emerged from her depression stronger and more determined than ever. She threw herself back into the Foundation's work with renewed passion, launching a new program specifically designed to support families dealing with pregnancy loss and infertility. Her personal experience gave her unique insight into what these families needed most, not just financial assistance, but emotional support and practical resources. The program became one of the Foundation's most successful initiatives, helping hundreds of couples navigate the complex emotions and medical challenges of reproductive loss. Sarah's willingness to share her own story publicly, despite her high-profile status, broke down barriers and encouraged others to seek help. Marcus watched with amazement as his wife turned her deepest pain into a source of healing for others. When Grace was 5, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time, both she and Marcus were cautiously optimistic, having learned not to take anything for granted. Sarah's pregnancy was carefully monitored, and she scaled back her foundation work to focus on her health. Jessica moved temporarily to be closer during the pregnancy, having taken a sabbatical from her own job to support her sister. Their son Robert was born healthy and strong, named after Sarah's father. As Sarah held her newborn son, she felt her father's presence powerfully, knowing he would have been overjoyed to have a grandchild carry his name. Marcus cried openly in the delivery room, overwhelmed by gratitude for his complete family and the journey that had brought them to this moment. Grace adored her baby brother immediately, showing the same nurturing instincts her mother possessed. Sarah and Marcus were amazed by their daughter's maturity and kindness, seeing evidence that they were raising a child who understood the importance of caring for others. Despite growing up with unlimited privilege, Grace seemed to inherently understand that her advantages came with responsibilities. As Robert grew from infant to toddler, the family settled into a rhythm that balanced their public responsibilities with private family time. Marcus had restructured his business operations to allow for more remote work, rarely traveling for more than a few days at a time. Sarah continued her foundation work but maintained strict boundaries around family time, having learned from her father's example that success meant nothing if it came at the expense of the people you loved most. The children grew up understanding that their family was different from others, but not because of money. Sarah and Marcus emphasized service, education, and empathy in everything they did. Grace and Robert volunteered alongside their parents from an early age, helping pack meals for homeless shelters and visiting nursing homes to spend time with elderly residents who had no family visitors. When Grace turned 8, she asked her parents why some families didn't have enough money for food or houses. Sarah and Marcus had been preparing for this conversation, knowing their children would eventually notice the stark inequalities in the world around them. They explained that life wasn't fair, but that people with resources had a responsibility to help those who were struggling. "Cho, is that why Mommy works so hard at the foundation?" Grace asked. Sarah nodded, pulling her daughter close. "Your grandfather taught me that love means taking care of people, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. The foundation is how we take care of people we may never meet, but who need help just the same." Grace seemed to understand instinctively, already showing signs of inheriting her mother's compassionate nature. She started asking to donate her allowance to various causes and began organizing charity drives at her school. Marcus and Sarah were careful not to push their children toward philanthropy, but they were pleased to see Grace developing her own sense of social responsibility. Robert, though younger, also showed remarkable empathy for a small child. He insisted on sharing his toys with children at the homeless shelter and cried when he saw elderly residents at nursing homes sitting alone. "Why don't they have families to visit them?" he asked Sarah during one of their regular volunteer visits. Sarah explained that sometimes families lived far away or weren't able to visit, which was why their visits meant so much. Jessica had become an integral part of their family life, spending holidays with them and serving as a trusted. "I look at your life sometimes and can't believe how differently things turned out," Jessica told Sarah during Grace's 8th birthday party. "You lost everything and found everything. I fought for everything and lost everything. But somehow we both ended up exactly where we needed to be." Sarah understood what her sister meant. If their father's will hadn't been initially misfiled, if Sarah hadn't struggled through poverty and grief, she might never have been working at that coffee shop the morning Marcus walked in. Every painful step of her journey had been necessary to bring her to the life she now cherished. As the children grew older, Sarah began writing a memoir about her experiences, hoping to inspire others who were facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. She wrote about losing her father, being betrayed by family, finding love in unexpected places, and learning to use privilege responsibly. The book became a bestseller, with all proceeds donated to the foundation. Marcus supported Sarah's writing completely, understanding that sharing their story could help others believe in the possibility of redemption and second chances. He contributed a chapter about the importance of staying humble despite success, and the joy of finding a partner who loved him for his character rather than his wealth. The memoir's success brought new attention to their foundation's work, resulting in increased donations and volunteer participation. Sarah was invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing lessons about resilience, family healing, and responsible wealth management. She always emphasized that her story wasn't about rags to riches, but about the transformative power of love and service. During one speaking engagement at a college graduation, Sarah was approached by a young woman who reminded her of herself at that age. Bright, determined, but facing overwhelming obstacles. The student was the first in her family to graduate college, but was drowning in debt and caring for aging grandparents. Sarah saw herself in this young woman's struggles and exhaustion. "What would you do if money wasn't a factor?" Sarah asked the student. "If you could follow your dreams without worrying about survival, what would that look like?" The young woman's eyes lit up as she described her passion for environmental law and her dream of fighting climate change through legal advocacy. By the end of their conversation, Sarah had arranged a full scholarship for law school and a summer internship with an environmental law firm. This encounter inspired Sarah to create a new foundation program specifically designed to support first-generation college graduates pursuing careers in public service. The program provided not just financial assistance, but mentorship, networking opportunities, and ongoing support as these young leaders built their careers. Within 3 years, program alumni were working in nonprofits, government agencies, and advocacy organizations across the country. Marcus watched with pride as Sarah's influence rippled outward, touching countless lives in ways they might never fully understand. Her foundation programs were being replicated in other cities, her memoir was being translated into multiple languages, and her speaking engagements were inspiring a new generation of socially conscious leaders. Grace, now 10, had begun writing her own stories about families helping each other through difficult times. She showed remarkable emotional intelligence for her age, often asking thoughtful questions about inequality and social justice. Robert, at 7, was developing his own interests in science and technology, already dreaming of inventions that could help solve world problems. "They're going to change the world," Marcus told Sarah one evening as they watched their children playing together in the garden. "But more importantly, they're going to be good people who understand that privilege comes with responsibility." Sarah squeezed his hand, grateful for the partner who'd helped her rebuild her life and the family they'd created together. As their 10th wedding anniversary approached, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. The scared, grieving woman who'd served Marcus coffee a decade ago could never have imagined the life they'd built together. Every challenge they'd faced, from her initial poverty to their pregnancy loss to the complexities of managing enormous wealth responsibly, had only strengthened their bond and deepened their commitment to each other and their shared values. The anniversary celebration was held at the botanical garden where they'd been married, with many of the same. "Sarah taught me that family isn't about what you inherit," she said, "but about what you give to each other every single day." As Sarah and Marcus danced to the same song they'd chosen for their wedding, surrounded by their children and the extended family they'd built through love and intention, Sarah thought about her father and the lessons he'd taught her about what really mattered in life. He would have been amazed by the wealth his daughter had married into, but Sarah knew he would have been proudest of the woman she'd become and the family she'd created. The story that had begun with betrayal and loss had become one of love, purpose, and redemption. Sarah had learned that true inheritance wasn't money or property, but values, character, and the capacity to love others well. In losing everything, she'd found everything that truly mattered. And in building a life dedicated to helping others, she discovered that the greatest wealth of all was the ability to make a difference in the world, one life at a time. As the years continued to unfold, the Reed family faced new challenges that tested everything they'd built together. Grace, now 15, had inherited her mother's strong sense of justice, but struggled with the weight of expectations that came with being the daughter of one of America's most prominent philanthropic couples. She'd grown up in the spotlight, with media attention following her family's every move, and the pressure was beginning to affect her teenage years. "I didn't choose this life," Grace confided to Sarah during one of their evening walks through Millbrook's quiet streets. "Everyone expects me to be perfect, to follow in your footsteps, to save the world. Sometimes I just want to be a normal teenager who complains about homework and thinks about boys." Sarah's heart ached for her daughter, remembering her own struggles with family expectations, though from the opposite end of the spectrum. Marcus and Sarah had tried to give their children as normal a childhood as possible, but the reality of their position made true anonymity impossible. Grace's classmates treated her differently once they learned about her family's wealth, some becoming overly friendly while others seemed resentful. She'd stopped trusting new friendships, never sure if people liked her for herself or for what her family could provide. Robert, now 12, faced different challenges. He'd been identified as academically gifted and was being courted by elite private schools across the country. Unlike Grace, who craved normalcy, Robert seemed energized by academic pressure and high expectations. He'd already started working on inventions in the family's home laboratory, showing particular interest in developing affordable medical devices for underserved communities. "He's going to burn out if he's not careful," Jessica warned Sarah during one of their sister lunches. "I see kids like this in my practice all the time. Brilliant children who put so much pressure on themselves that they forget to actually be children." Jessica's work with at-risk youth had given her unique insight into the pressures facing young people, even those from privileged backgrounds. The family's foundation work had grown exponentially, now operating in 43 cities with over 2,000 employees worldwide. Sarah found herself increasingly pulled into administrative duties and board meetings, spending less time on the direct service work that had originally drawn her to philanthropy. She worried that success was pulling her away from the hands-on approach that had made the foundation special in its early years. Marcus faced his own midlife recalibration as Reed Industries continued to expand globally. At 52, he'd achieved everything he'd dreamed of in business, but found himself questioning whether continued growth was the best use of his energy and talents. He'd been approached by several world leaders about taking on diplomatic roles, using his business acumen to address international economic challenges. "What if we're thinking about this all wrong?" Marcus suggested during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "What if instead of trying to grow bigger, we focused on going deeper? What if we took everything we've learned and really concentrated on solving specific problems completely, rather than spreading ourselves across so many different initiatives?" The conversation led to months of soul-searching and strategic planning. Sarah and Marcus decided to restructure both the foundation and Marcus's business operations, focusing their resources on 3 key areas: education access, healthcare innovation, and environmental sustainability. It meant saying no to hundreds of worthy causes, but it also meant they could apply their full attention and resources to creating systemic change. Grace was initially resistant to her parents' increased focus, feeling like their family life was being sacrificed for their public mission. "You're always traveling, always in meetings, always thinking about other people's problems," she accused during a particularly emotional family discussion. "When do you think about us? When do you think about me?" Her words hit Sarah like a physical blow, reminding her of her own childhood feelings when her father seemed more focused on business than family. That night, Sarah and Marcus made a difficult decision to delegate more operational responsibilities to their trusted team leaders, committing to being present for their children's remaining years at home. The decision proved wise when Grace began showing signs of depression during her junior year of high school. The pressure of college applications, combined with the constant media attention and her own uncertainty about her future, had overwhelmed her usually resilient spirit. Sarah recognized the warning signs immediately, having experienced her own struggles with depression after her miscarriage. "I don't know who I am apart from being your daughter," Grace admitted, during a particularly difficult therapy session that Sarah attended with her. "I love what you and Dad do, but I'm scared that everyone expects me to be just like you. What if I want something different? What if I'm not good enough to live up to what you've built?" Sarah's heart broke for her daughter, understanding intimately the burden of living up to others' expectations. She shared her own story of feeling inadequate compared to Jessica when they were young, and how losing everything had ultimately freed her to discover her own path. "You don't have to be me," Sarah assured Grace. "You just have to be the best version of yourself." With professional help and family support, Grace slowly emerged from her depression with a clearer sense of her own identity and interests. She'd developed a passion for documentary filmmaking, wanting to tell stories about social issues in ways that would reach younger audiences. Her first project, a short film about teenage mental health, won several student film festivals and launched her own path toward making a difference. Robert, meanwhile, had been accepted into a prestigious summer science program at MIT, where his work on affordable diagnostic equipment caught the attention of medical researchers. At 13, he was already thinking about patent law and how to ensure his inventions would be accessible to people who couldn't afford expensive medical care. His approach combined his father's business acumen with his mother's social consciousness in ways that amazed both parents. Jessica had been offered a promotion to Director of Social Services for her entire state, recognition of her exceptional work with vulnerable populations over the past decade. She was torn between accepting the position and staying closer to Sarah's family, having become such an integral part of Grace and Robert's lives that they considered her more like a second mother than an aunt. "Take the job," Sarah encouraged her sister during one of their evening phone calls. "You've worked too hard to pass up this opportunity. Besides, Grace and Robert need to see that the women in their family are leaders who pursue their own dreams, not just supporters of other people's ambitions." Jessica's new role proved to be perfectly suited to her skills and passion. She implemented innovative programs that were later adopted nationally, focusing particularly on supporting families dealing with elder care and generational poverty. Her work complemented Sarah's foundation efforts beautifully, creating a pipeline of support that addressed both immediate needs and long-term systemic issues. As Grace prepared for college, she surprised everyone by choosing to attend a small liberal arts school known for its strong film program, rather than one of the Ivy League institutions that had courted her aggressively. "I want to earn my own reputation," she explained to her parents. "I want people to respect my work because it's good, not because of who my family is." Sarah and Marcus supported her decision completely, understanding the importance of Grace forging her own path. They established a scholarship fund at her chosen school specifically for students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing careers in media and communications, but they made sure Grace's name wasn't associated with it publicly. Robert's academic trajectory remained accelerated, but Sarah and Marcus worked with his teachers to ensure he had time for normal teenage activities alongside his advanced studies. They enrolled him in rock climbing and martial arts, activities that challenged him physically, while giving him outlets for stress that didn't involve intellectual performance. The Foundation's focused approach began showing remarkable results within 3 years of the restructuring. Their education initiatives had improved graduation rates in target districts by 40%. Their healthcare programs had developed 3 breakthrough technologies that were being implemented globally, and their environmental work had helped establish sustainable practices in over 100 communities. Sarah's role had evolved from hands-on service provider to strategic visionary, a transition that initially felt uncomfortable but ultimately proved fulfilling in new ways. She discovered she had a talent for seeing connections between seemingly unrelated problems and developing comprehensive solutions that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Marcus had accepted a part-time advisory role with the United Nations, focusing on sustainable development goals and private sector engagement in global problem-solving. The position allowed him to use his business expertise for international humanitarian purposes while maintaining his commitment to family time and foundation work. On Grace's 18th birthday, the families celebrated with a small gathering that included Jessica, Maya, and several of the young people whose lives had been changed by the Foundation's programs. Sarah watched her daughter interact with these scholarship recipients and program alumni, seeing Grace's natural ability to connect with people from all backgrounds and her genuine interest in their stories and experiences. "She's going to be amazing," one of the scholarship recipients told Sarah quietly. "She really listens, you know? Not like she's trying to help or fix anything, but like she genuinely cares about what we have to say." Sarah smiled, recognizing that Grace had inherited the most important quality for meaningful service: authentic empathy. Robert, now 15, had begun working with his father on weekends, learning about business operations and financial management. Unlike Grace, who preferred creative and interpersonal pursuits, Robert showed natural aptitude for systems thinking and strategic planning. He'd proposed several improvements to the Foundation's operational efficiency that had saved significant resources. "He's going to revolutionize how nonprofits operate," Marcus predicted after Robert presented a detailed analysis of supply chain inefficiencies in their healthcare programs. "He sees patterns and solutions that most adults miss completely." Sarah was proud of both her children's unique gifts, understanding that their family's legacy would be carried forward in different but equally valuable ways. The family faced an unexpected test when Marcus was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer during a routine checkup. The diagnosis was caught early and the prognosis was excellent, but the experience reminded everyone how precious and fragile their time together really was. Sarah found herself reliving the fear and helplessness she'd felt during her father's illness, despite the vastly different circumstances. "I can't lose you," she whispered to Marcus the night before his surgery. "I just got my life back together. I can't go through losing someone I love again." Marcus held her close, understanding that her fear went deeper than the immediate medical situation. He'd become not just her husband but her anchor, the foundation of the new life she'd built from the ashes of her original dreams. The surgery was successful, and Marcus's recovery exceeded all expectations. The experience brought the family closer together, reminding them all that success and wealth meant nothing without health and time to enjoy relationships. Grace postponed starting college for a semester to be home during her father's treatment, a decision that demonstrated her growing maturity and family loyalty. During Marcus's recovery period, Sarah took on more of the Foundation's leadership responsibilities, discovering reserves of strength and capability she hadn't known she possessed. She'd always seen herself as Marcus's partner in their work, but stepping into primary leadership showed her that she'd become a formidable force for change in her own right. "You don't need me anymore," Marcus joked as he watched Sarah lead a complex international negotiation via video conference from their home office. "You've become the leader I always knew you could be." Sarah smiled, but she knew that wasn't true. She didn't need Marcus to validate her capabilities, but she would always need him as her partner and best friend. As Marcus returned to full health and activity, the family emerged from the crisis, stronger and more focused than ever. Grace started college with renewed appreciation for her family's bond and her own place within it. Robert channeled his anxiety. Jessica had proven herself invaluable during Marcus's illness, coordinating family schedules and providing emotional support that allowed Sarah to focus on foundation leadership without worrying about her children's needs. "I finally understand what it means to really be family," Jessica told Sarah as Marcus celebrated his clean bill of health. "It's not about what you inherit or what you're given. It's about what you give when it really matters." 20 years had passed since that morning when Sarah first met Marcus in the coffee shop, a broken woman serving coffee to a stranger who would become her salvation and partner. As she looked at her family gathered around their dinner table, Marcus healthy and laughing, Grace home from college with stories about her latest film project, Robert explaining his newest invention, Jessica sharing updates from her state-level work. Sarah felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought them all together. The scared young woman who'd lost her inheritance and her faith in family could never have imagined the life she'd eventually build. Every loss had led to something better. Every betrayal had taught her to recognize authentic love. Every challenge had revealed strength she hadn't known she possessed. The foundation work that had started as a way to honor her father's memory had become a global force for positive change, touching millions of lives across 6 continents. Most importantly, she'd learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the depth of relationships and the positive impact one life could have on countless others. Her father's real inheritance hadn't been money that could be stolen or fought over in court. It had been values, character, and the understanding that love expressed through service was the only legacy that truly mattered. As the family prepared for Grace's return to college and Robert's upcoming applications to accelerated university programs, Sarah knew their story was far from over. The next generation was ready to take the lessons they'd learned and apply them in ways their parents could never have anticipated. The cycle of service, love, and positive impact would continue, growing stronger with each generation that understood the responsibility that came with their privileges. The woman who'd once collapsed under the weight of loss and betrayal had become a cornerstone of strength for her family and a beacon of hope for countless others. Sarah's story had become proof that redemption was always possible, that second chances could lead to extraordinary outcomes, and that the most devastating losses could ultimately become the foundation for the most meaningful victories. Grace's college years flew by in a whirlwind of creative projects and personal growth. Her documentary work evolved from student films about social issues to professionally produced pieces that aired on major streaming platforms. Her junior year project, a feature-length documentary about families rebuilding after medical bankruptcy, won awards at several film festivals, and caught the attention of major networks. Most importantly to Sarah, Grace had found her own voice and purpose, creating change through storytelling rather than direct philanthropy. "She's doing what I always wished I could do," Sarah told Marcus as they watched Grace accept an award at a documentary film festival. "She's reaching people we could never reach through foundation work alone. She's making our message accessible to audiences who might never attend a charity gala or read a philanthropy report." Marcus nodded, recognizing that Grace had inherited Sarah's heart for service but expressed it through her own unique talents. Robert's path proved even more unconventional than his parents had anticipated. At 17, he'd been accepted into a joint MD/PhD program that would allow him to pursue both medical training and bioengineering research simultaneously. His goal was to develop medical technologies specifically designed for resource-limited settings, combining cutting-edge innovation with radical affordability. "He wants to be the doctor and the inventor," Robert explained to his family during his high school graduation dinner. I want to understand disease from the patient's perspective, and then create the tools to treat them, but make sure those tools can reach people everywhere, not just in wealthy hospitals. Sarah marveled at her son's integration of scientific ambition with social consciousness. The foundation had reached a milestone Sarah had never imagined when she first started honoring her father's memory. They'd successfully implemented programs. The healthcare technologies they'd funded were being manufactured at scale, providing affordable diagnostics and treatments in communities that had previously gone without basic medical care. Marcus had stepped back from day-to-day business operations to focus entirely on strategic philanthropy and his UN advisory work. At 57, he'd found that his greatest satisfaction came not from building wealth, but from deploying it effectively to solve systemic problems. I spent the first half of my career learning how to make money, he reflected to Sarah. Now I'm spending the second half learning how to give it away in ways that actually create lasting change. Jessica's influence had expanded beyond their family to become a national voice for social services reform. Her innovative approaches to supporting vulnerable populations had been adopted in 12 states, and she'd been invited to advise federal policymakers on poverty reduction strategies. She'd never remarried, having found deep fulfillment in her work and her role as aunt to Grace and Robert. I used to think success meant having more than other people, Jessica told Sarah during one of their quarterly sister retreats. Now I know it means helping other people have enough. Dad would have been proud of who we both became, even if it took us different paths to get here. Sarah agreed, understanding that their father's true legacy lived in the values they'd both eventually embraced. The family faced a new kind of challenge when Grace's documentary about medical bankruptcy led to her receiving death threats from people who opposed healthcare reform. The threats weren't credible, according to security experts, but they reminded everyone that public advocacy came with personal risks. Sarah found herself reliving the fear she'd felt during Marcus's illness, terrified that their family's prominence might endanger their children. "We can't live in fear," Grace insisted when her parents suggested she step back from controversial topics. "If we have platforms and resources, we have to use them. The people threatening me are exactly the reason this work matters." Her courage reminded Sarah of her own decision to share her story publicly despite the potential for criticism and judgment. Robert's medical school years coincided with a global health crisis that tested everything the foundation had built. When a novel infectious disease emerged in Southeast Asia, the rapid response systems they'd helped establish proved crucial in containing its spread. Robert interrupted his studies to volunteer with emergency response teams, using his engineering skills to help improve field diagnostic capabilities. "This is why we do this work," Sarah told Marcus as they watched news coverage of their son working alongside international health teams. "Not for recognition or legacy, but for moments like this when systems we've built actually save lives." Marcus squeezed her hand, both of them understanding that their life's work was being validated in the most meaningful way possible. Grace's career had evolved to include not just documentary filmmaking, but also consultation with nonprofits on how to use media more effectively for social change. At 25, she'd established her own production company that specialized in telling stories about systemic inequity and community-driven solutions. Her work complemented the foundation's efforts perfectly, creating emotional connections that inspired people to support policy changes and charitable giving. The family's influence had grown to the point where Sarah and Marcus were regularly consulted by world leaders on complex global challenges. Their approach, combining strategic thinking, resource deployment, and grassroots understanding, had proven effective in addressing problems that traditional diplomacy and aid had struggled to solve. Sarah often thought about the broken woman who'd served coffee all those years ago, amazed by the platform that loss and love had ultimately created. Robert completed his medical training and immediately established a research lab focused on developing medical devices that could be manufactured and maintained in low-resource settings. His first major breakthrough was a portable ultrasound system that cost less than $200 to produce, but provided diagnostic capabilities previously available only in major hospitals. The device was being manufactured in 8 countries, creating local jobs while providing essential medical services. "He's going to change medicine forever," the dean of his medical school told. As Sarah approached her 50s, She found herself reflecting more frequently on the journey that had brought her family to this point. The coffee shop where she'd met Marcus had been torn down and replaced with a chain store, but she drove by the location regularly, remembering the morning that changed everything. She'd kept in touch with Maya, who now managed one of the foundation's regional offices, and with several of the scholarship recipients who'd become leaders in their own communities. Jessica had been diagnosed with breast cancer the previous year, but caught it early and completed treatment successfully. The experience had brought the sisters even closer together, with Sarah providing the same kind of support Jessica had offered during Marcus's health scare. "We've become the family Dad always wanted us to be," Jessica said during her final chemotherapy session. "It just took us 25 years to figure out what that meant." Marcus's UN work had evolved into a permanent advisory role that kept him traveling internationally about half the time. Sarah sometimes joined him on these trips, particularly when they involved foundation partnerships or strategic planning. They developed a rhythm that balanced their individual pursuits with their shared mission and family commitments. Grace announced her engagement to a fellow filmmaker she'd met while working on a project about climate refugees. David shared her passion for social justice storytelling and had grown up in similar circumstances. His parents were both public defenders who'd raised him to understand privilege as responsibility. Sarah and Marcus were delighted with Grace's choice, seeing in David the same kind of partnership they'd built together. The wedding was held at the same botanical garden where Sarah and Marcus had married, with Grace insisting on the same simple elegance her parents had chosen. Jessica officiated the ceremony, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. As Sarah watched her daughter exchange vows, she thought about the cycle of love and commitment that had sustained their family through every challenge. Robert had started dating a fellow medical student from Ghana who shared his passion for global health equity. Akosua brought perspectives and experiences that challenged and enriched Robert's understanding of the communities he hoped to serve. Sarah loved watching her son learn from someone whose lived experience complemented his technical knowledge. The Foundation's 20th anniversary prompted Sarah to write a second book. This one focused on lessons learned from 2 decades of philanthropic work. She wrote about the importance of listening to communities rather than imposing solutions, the value of long-term commitment over quick fixes, and the necessity of addressing systemic causes rather than just treating symptoms. "We started this work thinking we could help people," Sarah wrote in the book's conclusion. "We learned that the people we were trying to help were actually teaching us about resilience, creativity, and hope. The most important thing we discovered was that effective philanthropy isn't about giving money to problems. It's about investing in people who are already working on solutions." Marcus contributed chapters about sustainable business practices and the importance of integrating social responsibility into corporate strategy from the beginning, rather than treating it as an add-on. His business school had established a case study program based on Reed Industries' approach to profit-with-purpose entrepreneurship. Grace's latest documentary project was about her own family's story, exploring themes of inheritance, loss, redemption, and service across 3 generations. She'd interviewed dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work, weaving their stories together with her family's journey. Sarah initially felt uncomfortable being the subject of Grace's professional attention, but she came to understand that their story could inspire others facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. "I want people to understand that transformation is always possible," Grace explained to her mother during one of their filmed conversations. "You lost everything and found everything. Aunt Jessica destroyed relationships and rebuilt them. Dad found love after believing it wasn't possible. Our family proves that people can change, that second chances matter, and that the worst experiences can become the foundation for the best outcomes." Robert's research had attracted international attention, and he'd been invited to present his work at major medical conferences around the world. At 26, he was already being recognized as a leader in the field of appropriate technology for global health. His innovations were being used in over 30 countries, and he'd trained hundreds of healthcare workers in device maintenance and repair. Sarah's role had evolved into something she'd never expected: elder stateswoman of philanthropy. She was regularly asked to mentor emerging donors, advise family foundations, and speak at conferences about sustainable approaches to charitable giving. Her journey from coffee shop employee to global philanthropist had become a case study in business schools and nonprofit management programs. The family gathered for Marcus's 60th birthday at their original home in Millbrook, now expanded but still maintaining the modest character he'd chosen when they first married. 3 generations sat around the same dining room table where they'd shared countless meals and conversations. Grace and David were expecting their first child. Jessica was planning her retirement to focus on writing a book about social services reform, and Robert had just announced his engagement to Akosua. "Look what we built," Marcus said as he raised his glass to toast the assembled family. "Not just the foundation or the businesses or the programs, but this family, these relationships, this understanding, that we're all responsible for taking care of each other." Sarah felt tears in her eyes, remembering the broken woman who'd sat in a lawyer's office 27 years earlier, believing she'd lost everything that mattered. As the evening wound down and family members began heading to their respective homes and hotel rooms, Sarah and Marcus sat together on their front porch, holding hands and watching the stars appear in the clear night sky. They'd made it through everything: loss, betrayal, illness, the pressures of wealth and fame, the challenges of raising children in the spotlight. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Jessica hadn't contested the will?" Marcus asked quietly. "If you'd gotten your inheritance right away and never had to work at the coffee shop?" Sarah considered the question, imagining a parallel life where she'd never met Marcus, never built the foundation, never learned what she was truly capable of achieving. "I would have been fine," she said finally. "Maybe even happy. But I never would have been this. I never would have understood what I was meant to do with my life, or found the person I was meant to do it with." She squeezed his hand. "Every terrible thing that happened to me was necessary to get me here. I wouldn't change any of it." The next morning brought news that would test this philosophy in unexpected ways. Sarah received a call from a lawyer informing her that Jessica had included her in her will as the primary beneficiary of her modest estate. Jessica hadn't discussed this decision with Sarah, but the accompanying letter explained her reasoning. "You showed me what it really means to inherit something valuable. I want to leave you the only thing I have that matters, the knowledge that I finally learned to be the sister Dad raised me to be." Sarah cried reading the letter, understanding that Jessica's true gift wasn't financial, but emotional, the recognition that they'd both grown into women their father would be proud of. The money would go directly into the foundation, but the letter would be treasured forever as proof that families could heal, even from the deepest wounds. Grace's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and she continued working on her documentary project right up until her due date. The film, titled What We Inherit, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim and distribution deals with major streaming platforms. It told the story of 3 families navigating loss, betrayal, and redemption, using Grace's own family as the central narrative thread. Robert and Akasua's wedding was held in Ghana, combining traditional ceremonies with modern celebrations. The entire family traveled to participate, and Sarah found herself deeply moved by the community's welcome and the emphasis on extended family and collective responsibility. The wedding reinforced her understanding that the values they'd tried to instill in their children were universal human principles, not unique to their particular circumstances. The Foundation's 25th anniversary was marked not with a gala, but with a global summit bringing together program participants, community leaders, and partner organizations from around the world. Sarah listened to presentations from people whose lives had been changed by Foundation programs, but who had then gone on to create change in their own communities. We were never the heroes of these stories, Sarah realized as she listened to a former scholarship recipient who'd become a leader in education reform in her home country. We were just the beginning. The real heroes are the people who took what we offered and built. After much discussion with Sarah and the children, he decided to accept the role, seeing it as the natural evolution of his commitment to using his skills for maximum positive impact. As Sarah prepared for this new chapter in their lives, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from that coffee shop meeting to global leadership in philanthropy and service. The scared, broken woman who'd served Marcus that first cup of coffee could never have imagined the life they'd built together, the family they'd raised, or the impact they'd created around the world. Grace's daughter was born on the anniversary of Robert Chen's death, a coincidence that Sarah chose to see as her father's way of reminding them that love and legacy transcended individual lifetimes. As she held her granddaughter for the first time, Sarah whispered the same words her father had said to her as a child. "You are loved, you are valuable, and you have something important to contribute to this world." The story that had begun with loss and betrayal had become one of love, service, and multi-generational impact. Sarah understood now that her father's real inheritance hadn't been money that could be stolen or willed away. It had been values, character, and the understanding that true wealth was measured not in what you accumulated, but in what you gave away, and the lives you touched in the process. 10 years later, Sarah stood in the same cemetery where she'd first learned the truth about Marcus's wealth, but this time she wasn't there for grief. She was there with her 5-year-old granddaughter Emma, teaching her about the great-grandfather she'd never met, but whose values lived on in every member of their family. Great-grandpa Robert taught Grandma that the most important thing in life is taking care of people, Sarah explained, as Emma placed fresh flowers on the headstone. And now we get to take care of people all over the world because of what he taught us. Emma nodded solemnously, already showing signs of the empathy that seemed to run in their family's DNA. Grace and David's documentary production company had become a major force in social justice filmmaking, with their work influencing policy changes in dozens of countries. Their second child, a son named Robert after his great-grandfather, was 2 years old and already showing his mother's curiosity about the world around him. Grace often brought both children to foundation events, wanting them to understand from an early age that privilege came with responsibility. Robert had established himself as one of the world's leading experts in appropriate medical technology, with his innovations saving countless lives in resource-limited settings. He and Akosua had 3 children together and split their time between research labs in Boston and fieldwork in Ghana, where they were establishing a permanent center for medical device innovation and training. Marcus's tenure as Secretary General of the International Development Consortium had transformed global approaches to humanitarian aid, emphasizing sustainable solutions and community-led development over traditional charity models. At 67, he was preparing to step down from the role, having achieved everything he'd hoped to accomplish in international service. Jessica had published her memoir about social services reform, which became required reading in social work programs across the country. Now in her 70s and officially retired, she spent her time mentoring young social workers and volunteering with the Foundation's family support programs. Her transformation from the selfish woman who'd fought over inheritance remained one of the most remarkable aspects of Sarah's story. The Foundation had grown beyond anything Sarah had imagined when she first started it in her father's memory. With operations in 87 countries and an endowment that ensured its work would continue for generations, it had become a model for effective philanthropy worldwide. Sarah had stepped back from day-to-day operations but remained as board chair, focusing on strategic vision and long-term planning. Emma's curious questions during their cemetery visit reminded Sarah of her own childhood conversations with her father about fairness, kindness, and responsibility. "Why do some people have lots of money and some people don't have any?" Emma asked as they walked back to the car. Sarah smiled, remembering asking her father the same question decades earlier. "That's a very good question, sweetheart," Sarah said, lifting Emma into her car seat. "Sometimes life isn't fair, but that's exactly why people who have been lucky need to help share them," Emma responded immediately. "But I'd make sure to save some for myself, too." Sarah laughed, delighted by her granddaughter's honesty and practical thinking. Even at 5, Emma was already grasping the balance between generosity and self-care that had taken Sarah decades to learn. That evening, the extended family gathered for their monthly dinner at Sarah and Marcus's home. The tradition had begun when Grace and Robert were teenagers, and had continued even as the family spread across different continents. Technology allowed those who couldn't be physically present to join virtually, creating a global family meeting that kept everyone connected despite their various commitments. Grace called in from a film festival in Europe, where her latest documentary about climate refugees was premiering. Robert and Akosua joined from Ghana, where they were in the middle of training a new cohort of medical technicians. Jessica participated from her apartment in the state capitol, still sharp and engaged despite her advancing age. "I have an announcement," Grace said during the virtual gathering, her excitement visible even through the computer screen. "David and I have been approached about creating a documentary series about successful philanthropy models. They want to use our family's story as the centerpiece, but focus on how effective giving actually works in practice, rather than just telling feel-good stories." Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and discomfort at the thought of their family being in the spotlight again. Over the years, she'd grown more comfortable with public attention as a tool for advancing their mission, but she still preferred working behind the scenes to being the center of attention. "What would that look like?" Marcus asked, his experience with media helping him think through the practical implications. "And more importantly, how would we ensure it actually helps advance the work, rather than just celebrating us personally?" The conversation that followed exemplified the family's approach to every opportunity: careful consideration of potential impact, honest assessment of personal motivations, and consensus building around shared values. By the end of the evening, they'd agreed to participate in the series with specific conditions designed to maximize its educational value while minimizing exploitation of their personal story. Robert's research had reached a new milestone with the development of a diagnostic device that could detect diseases before symptoms appeared, using technology so simple it could be manufactured anywhere in the world for less than $50. The breakthrough promised to revolutionize preventative medicine in underserved communities, potentially saving millions of lives through early intervention. "Dad would have been amazed by this," Sarah told Robert during one of their weekly video calls. "He always believed that the best solutions were the simplest ones, and that real innovation came from understanding people's actual needs rather than just pursuing technological sophistication." The Foundation's education programs had achieved something unprecedented: measurable improvement in learning outcomes across every region where they operated, regardless of local economic conditions or political circumstances. Their approach, combining teacher training, community engagement, and culturally appropriate curricula, had become the gold standard for educational development worldwide. Sarah often thought about the coffee shop employee she'd been all those years ago, struggling to imagine a future beyond her next rent payment. That woman couldn't have conceived of the global impact her family would eventually create, but Sarah understood now that every step of her journey had been necessary preparation for the life she was meant to live. Emma's questions during their cemetery visits had become more sophisticated as she grew older. Now 7, she wanted to understand not just what great-grandpa Robert had taught Grandma, but how those lessons had grown into the work their family did around the world. Sarah found herself explaining complex concepts about systemic inequality, sustainable development, and social justice to a child whose questions cut straight to the heart of why their work mattered. "If we help everyone, will there be any poor people left?" Emma asked during one of their walks through Millbrook's downtown area, which had been revitalized partly through foundation investment in small business development. Sarah considered the question carefully, wanting to give an honest answer that didn't overwhelm her granddaughter with the complexity of global poverty. "There will probably always be people who need help," Sarah said finally, "but if we do our job right, there will be fewer of them, and the help they need won't last as long. The goal isn't to fix everything forever, but to help people learn how to fix things for themselves." Marcus's retirement from international service allowed him to spend more time with his grandchildren and to focus on writing his own memoir about the intersection of business success and social responsibility. Publishers were eager for his insights into sustainable capitalism and the evolution of corporate social responsibility over the past 3 decades. Jessica's health had begun declining as she entered her 80s, but her mind remained sharp and her commitment to social justice unwavering. She'd moved into a senior living community near Sarah and Marcus, choosing a facility where she could continue mentoring young social workers while receiving the care she needed. "I never thought I'd be grateful for getting old," Jessica told Sarah during one of their weekly visits. "But watching you and the kids carry on Dad's values in ways he never could have imagined makes every day feel meaningful. I may not have inherited his money, but I definitely inherited his pride in this family." Grace and David's documentary series about philanthropy premiered to critical acclaim and sparked national conversations about wealth inequality and effective giving. The episodes featuring their family's story were particularly impactful, showing both the personal journey from loss to purpose and the practical mechanics of creating sustainable change. "We're not the heroes of this story," Grace emphasized during interviews promoting the series. "The heroes are the people in communities around the world who take resources and opportunities and build something bigger with them. We're just the middle part of a much larger story about human resilience and collective responsibility." Robert had been elected to the World Health Organization's executive board, the youngest person ever to hold the position. His election reflected global recognition of his contributions to accessible healthcare technology and his unique perspective on bridging innovation with equity. At 35, he was already being mentioned as a potential future Director General of the organization. The Foundation's 30th anniversary was marked not with celebration, but with the launch of its most ambitious project yet, a global initiative to eliminate preventable childhood mortality within 20 years. The goal was audacious, requiring coordination between governments, NGOs, corporations, and community organizations worldwide, but Sarah believed it was achievable with sufficient commitment and resources. 30 years ago, I started this foundation to honor my father's memory, Sarah said during the launch event. Today, we're launching this initiative to honor the memory of every child we've lost to preventable causes and the hope of every child we can still save. This isn't about our legacy, it's about their future. Emma, now 9, had started volunteering with her grandmother at local foundation events, showing the same natural empathy and leadership qualities that had characterized every generation of their family. She'd organized a school fundraiser for clean water projects and had begun learning Spanish so she could communicate with children in some of the foundation's partner communities. "She reminds me of you at that age," Marcus told Sarah as they watched Emma confidently address a group of adult donors about the importance of education access. "Same fierce determination to make things fair for everyone. Same inability to accept that suffering is just the way things have to be." Sarah's influence had expanded beyond philanthropy to include policy advocacy, with her testimony helping shape international agreements on sustainable development and human rights. World leaders regularly sought her counsel on complex humanitarian challenges, recognizing her unique combination of strategic thinking, operational experience, and moral authority. As Sarah approached her 60th birthday, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary arc of her life and the multi-generational impact of her father's values. The scared young woman who'd served Marcus coffee 4 decades earlier had become a global leader, whose work touched millions of lives across 6 continents. But more than the external achievements, Sarah treasured the internal transformation she'd experienced, from someone who felt powerless and forgotten, to someone who understood her own capacity to create change. She'd learned that true inheritance wasn't what you received, but what you chose to do with whatever you were given, whether that was enormous wealth or devastating loss. The story that had begun with betrayal and collapse had become one of redemption, service, and multi-generational impact. As Sarah watched Emma playing with her younger cousins in the same backyard where Grace and Robert had grown up, Robert Chen had died, believing his youngest daughter didn't know how much he loved her. But his love had lived on in every choice Sarah made, every life she touched, and every lesson she passed on to her children and grandchildren. The inheritance he'd really left her, compassion, integrity, and the understanding that love means taking care of others, had proven more valuable than any amount of money could ever be. As the sun set over Millbrook and the family gathered for dinner, Sarah felt her father's presence in the laughter of his great-grandchildren, the passionate discussions about justice and equity, and the quiet understanding that they were all part of something larger than themselves. The broken woman who had once collapsed at his funeral had become the foundation upon which an empire of love and service was built, proving that the most devastating losses could indeed become the most meaningful victories. The story would continue with Emma and her cousins, each finding their own ways to express the values that had sustained their family through every challenge. But Sarah knew that whatever paths they chose, they would carry forward the most important inheritance of all: the knowledge that they were loved, that they mattered, and that they had both the responsibility and the capacity to make the world a better place for everyone who came after them. As Sarah tucked Emma into bed that night, her granddaughter asked one final question that stopped her in her tracks. "Grandma, do you think Great-Grandpa Robert knew this would all happen when he wrote his will?" Sarah sat quietly for a long moment, considering the question that had haunted her for decades. Then, suddenly, she understood with perfect clarity. Her father hadn't made a mistake with his will, he'd known exactly what he was doing. The betrayal. He'd seen Jessica's weakness and Sarah's strength. He'd known that Jessica needed to learn the hard way that money couldn't buy happiness or family, while Sarah needed to discover her own resilience and capacity for love. The misfiled will hadn't been an accident. It had been a father's final lesson to both his daughters about what truly mattered. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I think he knew exactly what would happen. He gave us both exactly what we needed, even though it took us years to understand it." As she turned off the lights and walked downstairs to where Marcus was waiting, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. Her father's greatest gift hadn't been an inheritance she could spend. It had been a journey that taught her who she was meant to become. She'd lost everything and found everything, exactly as he'd somehow known she would. The scared woman who'd collapsed at his funeral had indeed inherited the most valuable treasure of all: the knowledge that love, expressed through service to others, was the only legacy that truly lasted forever. Sarah smiled, finally understanding that she'd been rich all along. She just hadn't known how to count what really mattered. The end.